I gave a lecture similar to this about, I think, 5 or 6 years ago at Goldsmiths in the Monday lectures. And the reason that I've decided to revive it is the different context. which should be, fairly clear what that is. Namely, the eruption of images of beheadings on the internet, associated primarily with IS. Now, I'm not going to show any pictures or videos related to those beheadings. I should warn you, however, that there will later on be some fairly gruesome pictures in the art context, primarily. I don't know, should I warn you? Okay, I'll probably forget, but one of my justifications for not showing these videos, apart from the fact that I think to show them would be very problematic, is that I'm not going to talk about the history of beheading in the Islamic tradition. There is writing on this. You can find it, including scholarly, you can find this on the internet. But I want to rather locate these images within the Western context of the history of the imagery and the political practice of decapitation. Partly because I'm taking ISIS not so much as a return to some kind of tradition, but as a phenomenon of modernity, including post-colonial modernity, the drawing up of boundaries, the founding of states, and so on, but also the technological modernity of the internet and social media, which is the context within which these images function. And it really struck me, thinking about this, that they seem to connect with almost every dimension of the Western history of decapitation. In some cases, in some sense, I would say probably deliberately in order to use it, and maybe in some cases on a less conscious level. Now, obviously, decapitation has a long history in relation not only to execution, but also to warfare. I mean, you can see it in Goya's Disasters of War, partly as an atrocity of mutilation. And by the way, you can probably read the caption, "Great feat with dead," a sort of ironic, an ironic caption of these etchings that Goya made in the context of the Napoleonic Wars in Spain. Decapitation functions not only as an atrocity to frighten, to scare the enemy, but I would say also historically because of the need to identify those who have been killed. If you think before photography, your king sends you off to sort of kill somebody. How do you show that you've actually done it? You take the head back with you. Or to show that some criminal has really been executed, you put their head on a stake and put it on a bridge or in a thoroughfare so that people can see it. You could compare this, for example, with the photographs of the famous photographs of Che Guevara dead, which part of the function of which was to prove that he actually had been killed. So those are sort of two functions of atrocity and identification. There's also a very important dimension, which I'm going to come to, which I think is relevant in the present context, which has to do with the relation of decapitation to sovereignty and to the foundation of a nation or a political order. So decapitation has this role not only as punishment, but as a form of founding violence. First of all, to take a step back, I want to consider the image of the head that petrifies. That, of course, is the head of the Gorgon, which dates back a very long way to ancient Greece. I mean, we have examples from the 6th century BC of this head of this woman surrounded by snakes. Medusa was one of the Gorgons, and the only mortal one. The Gorgons were, interestingly, creatures who were produced by Gaia to help the Titans against the new Olympian deities. So, I mean, it could be argued that they are linked with a sort of a matriarchal moment or religion pre the patriarchal Olympian gods. There is a dimension of the feminine, an aspect of sexuality in relation to decapitation will recur in this talk. And it's a sort of presentation in the context of this conflict of female sexuality as horrifying, as petrifying. Now, you probably all know the myth of Perseus, who was sent to kill the Medusa. The Medusa's head was, as you can see, instead of her hair, she had snakes, or as well as her hair, she had snakes. Her power was to turn people she looked at into stone. That's why I describe this as the head that petrifies. You probably also know how Perseus gets around this by looking in a shield which reflects Medusa's head, so that he is not affected by the direct gaze and himself turned into stone. So he's able to cut off the head of Medusa. And then he returns to the court of King Polydectes, who sent him. King Polydectes sent him with the idea that Perseus would die. He wanted to get rid of Perseus. So he goes back to King Polydectes, and then he takes out of a bag Medusa's head, holds it up, and the whole court turns into, including King Polydectes, turns into stone. So it's this idea of a head that terrifies and that petrifies the enemy. Freud, of course, has interpreted this in terms of castration and the snakes as phalluses. But you know, apart from that, one could interpret it that way. But apart from that, you know, what I want to focus on is this idea of petrification or terror, and clearly that applies to some extent to the use of the decapitated head currently. Here is a famous and extraordinary painting by Medusa, by Caravaggio of Medusa from 1597. He actually painted it. It's in a tondo. It's round, the painting, and he painted it on a convex piece of wood, so that the painting itself becomes like the shield that reflects the head of Medusa at the viewer. He also used a boy as the model in this case for Medusa. You can see the blood streaming from the neck. And it's also a kind of tribute to painting, because painting then is shown to be as as vivid as a real reflection of Medusa, and maybe you admire it so much that you are frozen in front of it yourself. He also made two paintings of David with the head of Goliath, and this is another image of decapitation. The warrior David destroying the giant enemy with his catapult, and then cutting off his head and bringing it back with him to Saul. He entered the painting. The moment of the painting is the head being shown in triumph to Saul. There are two versions of this that he painted. It's obviously an image that kind of must have fascinated Caravaggio himself. One of them on the left has the head more or less facing directly to the viewer, which puts the viewer in the position effectively of Saul. The other one has the head looking down and to the side and with the mouth open. It's said that the head of the painting on the right is Caravaggio's own. So it's a self-portrait of Caravaggio with his head cut off by this young man. So it functions on a number of different levels, personal, sexual, but is also an image of as it were, weaker adversary triumphing over a giant. Again, one might think of the application of this to the way that the head is being used today. So another set of images which I think are relevant to continue to consider are the images of the head as the head of a martyr, or in relation to martyrdom. And this would be the head of St. John the Baptist. This painting is by Giovanni Bellini from 1465 to 70, again on a tondo, but this time that, of course, the tondo represents not the shield, but the plate in the story. I mean, effectively, you could say that John the Baptist is the first Christian martyr. And as you know, I'm sure the story, John preceded Christ and announced Christ and introduced the ritual of baptism as a form of absolution from sin. He also condemned Herod the Tetrarch for marrying the ex-wife of his brother, Herodias. Herodias wanted John killed. Herod resisted this. Herod's daughter, also called Herodias, has danced before him at her mother's instigation. Herod was so pleased with what he saw that he offered her anything that she wanted, and her mother told her to ask for the head of John the Baptist. So reluctantly, Herod ordered John the Baptist to be killed and his head to be brought on a plate. So this is another very powerful and influential image of the decapitated head in relation to religion, but not, I think, only in relation to religion, in relation to Christianity, because the story is also a story of desire. And John the Baptist's status in relation to that story, in relation to the sort of Oedipal interaction between Herodias, the daughter, and Herod, is the one who repudiates desire, the one who is, in a sense, beyond desire. Now, the beyond desire you could interpret or understand as a relation to, and those of you who come to my sort of various perversion events will be familiar with this, a relation to both the death drive and to jouissance, to a kind of enjoyment, an enjoyment implied in the relation with the absolute, which is beyond desire, which functions according to substitution and according to lack. So it's an enjoyment which could also be associated with religious ecstasy and with mysticism, as indeed the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan does, in that he explores it through the writings of mystics, particularly female mystics, in fact. So it's a relation. Jouissance could be understood also in terms not only of a sort of painful, extreme enjoyment beyond desire, but also as a relationship to the absolute, and in a sense, a refusal of substitution, indeed a kind of refusal of difference as well. So the image, functions, I think, in this double sense, and may tell us or imply something about the ambivalence of martyrdom. We could, of course, come back to this. And probably we will need to. Here's another image by painting by Andrea Solario, head of John the Baptist from 1470. Is it a portrait or is it a still life? Is it kind of interesting art historical quibble? That may come back, because if it's a still life, then the head is a sort of object, right? And what does it mean to reduce the head to a mere object? We may want to talk about that later on, and here are some further images, which also perhaps emphasize the sexual dimension. And I thought I would, since we're talking about beheading, decapitation, and sexuality, of course, to introduce the image of Judith beheading Holofernes. Again, here is a version by Caravaggio from 1599. He was very much clearly into beheading of one sort or another. And here is two versions by Artemisia Gentileschi from 1612 to 1320. She was also very much engaged with this image, and one might surmise, not least because she had been raped and was the subject of was a litigant in a court case around this. And this has become, quite an important sort of topos in feminist discussion as well. Now I want to make a move to another dimension of decapitation that I mentioned before when I talked about the relation of decapitation to the formation or the institution of a state or of a political order. And that is the role of decapitation in relation to sovereignty, and specifically in relation to the sovereign. Now, this needs to be understood, as has been discussed by various people, including in one of the texts I put out. And the key historian to talk about this is a Polish historian called Ernst Kantorowicz, who wrote a very important book on late medieval and Tudor kingship called The King's Two Bodies. He came up with this notion that, or he didn't come up with it, he in a sense, uncovered this notion, this legal notion, in discussions of the time, that the sovereign had two bodies, not one body. So the sovereign has two bodies. The sovereign has a mortal body, which dies, which gets ill, which has to eat, which is like a normal mortal body. But the sovereign also has a spiritual or divine or corporate body. The term corporate body is used, as well as notions of the spiritual and the divine. By corporate, it means that the body embodies the nation. So that other body, that second body, is both linked with the divine and with God, but also incorporates the nation. The model for that, of course, is Christ, who is both the head and body of the church. So the idea of Christ as head and body of the church, and as fully incarnated, fully human, was transferred onto the idea of the sovereign having two bodies. So you've probably all heard this phrase, the king is dead, long live the king. There may have been a gap between the dying of the old king and the crowning of the new king. And one of the practices, one of the medieval practices, was to create an effigy in wax of the king, who would be the king, be the embodiment of the sovereign corporate body in between those two moments. So the corporate body, the sovereign, the divine body of the king continues from one monarch to another and ensures the continuity of the reign, while the mortal body is subject to death. Now, if you know this portrait of Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I, painted around 1592, it's known as the Ditchley portrait by Marcus Gerrits the Younger. An extraordinary picture. I mean, you might remark, first of all, as people often do of these paintings, it looks so stiff and unlifelike. I mean, if you look at the much more naturalistic portrait painting going on in Italy at the time, this looks like some sort of primitive or naive picture. But of course, there were reasons why it was painted to appear as it did. I mean, there were plenty of paintings at the time which were much more lifelike. It was painted like this because it was necessary for Queen Elizabeth to emphasize her sovereign corporate body over her natural body, not least because she was a woman. So she had to, in a sense, downplay the naturalness of her female body, her desires and so on. I mean, she never married, she was married to England and whatever. And she had to kind of emphasize that she had this sort of primarily queenly body. So here you see a representation based on the idea of the king's two bodies, an attempt to represent the sovereign, sacred body of the queen. And of course it also has allegorical significance. She's depicted as astride the world. She's actually standing on a map. The sun in the sky is reflecting her glory. The lightning on the other side reflects her power. There's a celestial sphere in one of her ears as a sort of earring. And it was the celestial sphere was an emblem of the accession day tilts, which was a celebration of her accession to the throne held every year on November the 17th until she died. So it was very much linked with these sort of festivals and rituals around her queenship. Okay. Here you have Thomas Hobbes, the illustration to the frontispiece of the famous book of political theory by Thomas Hobbes, written in 1651, already the time of the English Civil War, about where the king really gets his legitimacy from. And this frontispiece was painted by this Dutch artist Abraham, or rather etched by Abraham Bosch, who also illustrated a book on perspective, which is quite significant that he did these two things. So it's a famous illustration. You see the body of the king holding a mitre, the sword, the defender of the realm, and the source of power and justice. He's wearing his crown, and his body is a little bit hard to see, but his body, which looks a bit like scales, consists of his people. So there are these little figures etched onto his body, and they're all facing him, as indeed are you facing him as a viewer across the land that he is defending. So the body consists of the people. Well, the king is both head and body, but primarily he's the head, and the body comprises the people. And the idea is that the king needs the people. I mean, the king can't be the king without the people, who can be just a head, basically, without the people. So he needs the people to sustain his body, as the people need the king to watch over and guide them. But that was quite an important twist in the story of monarchy, because you consider the painting of Queen Elizabeth. Clearly she's linked with divinity, and she's linked with the idea that the corporate body is divinely sanctioned. So you heard of the divine right of kings, that what legitimates the sovereign is God. And that's the idea. That changes with Hobbes, because how sovereignty arises for Hobbes is out of the sort of nasty, brutish, and short nature of life, and the fear of others and of conflict. People are willing to give up their freedom in order for the sake of their security. So the monarch guards the security of the nation, and we, the people, give up our freedom to do whatever we like, because we know that without the sovereign, everybody would be fighting everybody else, and we'd all be dead, basically. So it's something like a kind of social contract theory, perhaps not exactly, but because it's sort of naturalized rather than legal. But what's important, I think, in the twist that this takes is that the legitimation of sovereignty is effectively bottom-up rather than top-down. The sovereign is legitimated by the people who need him. So it's an important twist. But nonetheless, it still maintains the idea that the body of the king is the embodiment of sovereignty. Sovereignty, the sovereignty of the nation, sovereignty as the sort of will of the nation, the power to act of the nation, the power to defend its borders of the nation, and so on, is embodied in the body of the king. Now, I'm going to slowly move towards the French Revolution. You all know what happened then, but before, let's just look quickly at three paintings of three Louis. Louis the 14th, 15th, and 16th, 1701, 1763, 78, so you know, almost 80 years spanning between them. These are three paintings of French kings, and I think the sort of interesting aspect of them is a kind of tension, I think, that appears in the attempt to convey sovereignty, and the sovereignty of the king's body in a more naturalistic mode than the mode of the painting of Queen Elizabeth or of the etching by Boss for the Leviathan. Because what the signifiers of sovereignty become are something like, you know, very heavy clothes, mostly, accoutrements, cloaks, other things, and the whole sort of relationship takes on a dimension of absurdity. I mean, whether it was, you know, in a sense absurd for them, probably not, but it becomes apparent perhaps now of the discrepancy between the mortal body of the king and the accoutrements of grandeur, which are supposed to signify, you know, the sovereign body, which was still, you know, believed in, and the divine sanction of the monarch. Okay. This is the tennis court oath drawn by Jacques-Louis David in 1791, and was a gathering of the Third Estate in the tennis court in Versailles when they were forbidden to gather by the king. The nation was considered to be three estates, you know, the lords, as it were, the clergy, and, you know, the sort of middling property owners, who were the Third Estate. And there was a sort of agitation against the monarchy, and a meeting was arranged in Versailles, presided over by Louis XVI of the three estates. And the question that arose was the relationship between those three estates, whether they should meet and vote together, whether the Third Estate had an equal vote to the other estates, or a vote commensurate with the number of people that it represented, which it didn't have. So they were arguing that that this system in which they were always outvoted by the other two estates should be replaced by a proper representative system, so that they had been elected to represent the people. Locked out of the place where they were supposed to meet, they went to a tennis court and met there instead, you know, and declared themselves the representatives of France. So this is an image of, or an attempt to image the people, and they're also, you know, specific characters, of course, Robespierre, Sieyès, they're all there. But it's also a sort of crowd. So it's an attempt to create a representation that would somehow convey the notion of both that these are representatives, but that they represent the people rather than, you know, a specific group. That was the claim. Okay, 1793, Louis XVI was guillotined. So we're moving through the early phases of the French Revolution, in which the primary argument was that France should be a constitutional monarchy like England, basically, already was at that time, you know, governed by a parliament or a legislative assembly, but with the king having a constitutional role. That, for various reasons, fell apart. The king tried to escape and was brought back with his family. Armies were gathering on the borders of France. The church was also militating against the revolution. The revolution was very much kind of threatened. So the people were sort of whipped up, and the legislators argued for the execution of Louis XVI. And before his execution, he was, as it were, stripped of his status, and he was given the name Louis Capet, or Capet, or C-A-P-E-T, Capet, I suppose. And he was accused and tried under that name, as if he were an ordinary person, like everyone else. So basically, you know, what's going on here is the attempt to reduce Louis to his natural body, and the equation of the natural body with equality, that all men it would have been then. I mean, now we would like to say even all humans or all humankind are equal, and this is grounded in nature, as opposed to a hierarchical system with the king at the top, grounded in religion, in terms of the divine right of kings and the king's two bodies. This creates a kind of paradox or problem when he comes to be executed. I mean, there was also, I should mention, a conflict within the revolutionaries between those who argued for a representative legislature and those who argued for direct democracy based on what were called the clubs, the Jacobin clubs. Rousseau was kind of the philosophical basis for the direct democracy party, which included Robespierre. And in the end, they were the ones that that won out until the end of the Terror. Now, to get back to the problem of the execution of Louis in relation to his two bodies and the reduction of him to his natural body, on the one hand, the argument was that, you know, he's a person like anybody else. He committed a crime and he should be killed. On the other hand, this execution is a crucial event in the foundation of the Republic. It's the end of the period of monarchy and the beginning of a new order. So it's one of the foundational moments in the French Revolution. So how can he be so ordinary if he performs this role? So they were caught in a kind of paradox. Because he has to be executed as monarch and as corporate body, in order that sovereignty will spread from him to the people. As it were, you know, his blood will flow over all the people and they will be, you know, baptized as sovereign in their equality. And this is also why it's linked to the idea of a direct democracy rather than representative democracy, because then everyone is sovereign. But in order for that to be the case, you know, he had to, in a sense, still maintain the sense of the corporate body. And the execution becomes a kind of sacrificial act performed on a scapegoat, as well as being the killing of one who is no different from any other. So the victim is at once a mere living being and a sort of exceptional other. And this, in a sense, this problem becomes also linked with the terror when the guillotine is used on, I don't know, I believe some 17,000 people. Massive amount of killing over a year. In order to, as it were, purify the revolution, in order to expel or in order to destroy the enemies within, as well as the enemies without, of the revolution in its purity. But it was somehow corrupted and had to be cleansed through this terror. This is where the notion of terror, which is bandied about, comes from that moment of a sort of attempted purification of the revolution. And the guillotine the guillotine was named after Joseph Ignace Guillotin, who was a French physician who argued actually for the reformation of capital punishment. And one of his first article of his argument in front of the National Assembly, the Revolutionary National Assembly, was that all offences of the same kind would be punished by the same type of punishment, irrespective of the rank or status of the guilty party. And the guillotine, which was not actually invented by him, but was named after him, because he advocated for this equality of punishment. So the idea of the guillotine was that everybody was equal and would be subject to the same capital punishment if they were convicted. Whereas previously, decapitation was reserved for royalty and for people of high status, as opposed to, say, hanging, which would be, for people of low status. I mean, it was also considered to be humane because very fast, and they said that who gives evidence, is obviously a good question, but they said that it would feel like a breeze on the back of the neck. But the idea was that it probably is a lot more humane than using, out-of-date drugs or something like that, as is the case today. So the point I'm making is that it was identified with equality, with this idea that everyone is equal. Now, the idea of the execution of Louis is that sovereignty would be redistributed to the people. The result is that something other than the head becomes the source of corporate continuity or the eternal life of the people. It can't inhere in being a mere mortal. What occurs is the fusion of sovereignty and life. And life itself changes its character, becomes something in excess, becomes something more than biological life. So the life that you're talking about, when you're talking about the life of the people, is more than their mere biological life. It's neither human nor animal. It's neither inside nor outside, and neither inside nor outside the very republic that the execution of Louis XVI was supposed to found. So this life, as is argued by Eric Sandner in one of the texts I've proposed that you read, becomes a kind of monstrous life, an excessive life. So now I'd like to, well, I think I have one or another picture here. It's a sort of print that was distributed of Louis's head being held up over, as you see below, the cap of a revolutionary. The blood is dripping over this cap of the revolution, of the symbol of the revolution. So the Phrygian cap. So this is a very image of the redistribution of sovereignty through the execution of the king. So I want to move now, perhaps more quickly. This was really the sort of perhaps crucial part of the talk, to the consequences, and one of which is the connection between the head and the idea of biopower. So what occurs is the de-transcendentalizing of the head as the seat of rationality. It becomes an object of knowledge in medical and criminal discourses. So I'm moving from this idea of life to biopower. And it's interesting today to see the return of a version of phrenology in neuroscience, locating emotions and thoughts in the physical brain. Here are two images of guillotine work. One is a sort of dummy, and one is an actual head in a museum of criminal anthropology founded by Cesare Lombroso in 1892. So we're talking about now you jumped ahead, we're in the late 19th century. The criminal head basically as an object of study. So the criminal head is an object of study. One, the de-transcendentalizing of the head. The head is a physical object. It comes back into questions of identity and identification, as I mentioned earlier on. Another dimension of this is the tearing apart of the head and the face, or the distinction of the head and the face. The head as an object, and the face as the location of another, which is one of the reasons why these things are rather disturbing to look at. This idea was picked up by Rainer Maria Rilke, who Julia Ing mentioned last week, in his prose work, The Notebooks of Malte Lorenz Brigger, which was published in 1910, and will, I think, convey the sense of this separation of the head and the face in literal terms. He writes of walking down the street and seeing people's faces. He says, other people change their faces one after the other with uncanny speed and wear them out. At first it seems to them that they've enough to last them forever, but before they're even 40, they're down to the last of them. Of course, there is a tragic side to it. They're not used to looking after faces. Their last one wore through in a week, and there's holes in it, and in many places it's as thin as paper. Bit by bit, the bottom layer, the non-face, shows through. And they go about wearing that. But that woman bent forward with her head in her hands. She's completely fallen into herself. It was at the corner of Rue Notre-Dame des Champs. He's in Paris at the time working as an assistant to Rodin. It was at the corner of Rue Notre-Dame des Champs. I began to tread softly the moment I caught sight of her. Poor people shouldn't be disturbed when they're deep in thought. What they're searching for might still occur to them. The street was too empty. Its emptiness was bored with itself, and it pulled away the sounds of my footsteps and clattered around all over the place with them like a wooden clog. Out of fright, the woman reared up too quickly, too violently, so that her face was left in her two hands. I could see it lying there, the hollowness of its shape. It cost me an indescribable effort to keep looking at those hands and not at what they'd torn away from. I dreaded seeing the inside of a face, but I was much more afraid of the exposed rawness of the head without a face. So you can ask him, what is he afraid of seeing when he refuses to look at the head without face? I think it can't be just, entrails or something, or bone or flesh. I mean, surgeons look at that all the time, don't they? It seems to be an indication of some other sort of horrible life that is underneath the face, underneath the surface. And maybe not unconnected with that strange life that's unleashed in the contradiction or paradox of the execution of the king in the French Revolution. I mean, here's a picture of a murderer Fournier executed in Tours in 1920 with his identity photographs. You see the connection between the head and identification. And here is a work by Douglas Gordon which plays on this idea of the sort of relation of the guillotine to the object and to knowledge. Because one of the things that was much discussed was whether consciousness was retained for any period of time after the head was cut off. And I believe experiments were held when somebody being guillotined was told, if I talk to you, wink with your right eye, or something like this when you hold up your head. But I don't think any successful experiments were performed. But what Douglas Gordon did was he made an installation in a completely darkened space where you have a bulb on and you have a text called 30 seconds text. And the text describes exactly one of those experiments. And an apparent kind of success. But after 30 seconds, the bulb goes out and you're in complete darkness. And 30 seconds is supposed to be the length of time that consciousness is retained, when the head is cut off, according to this theory. So he makes you enact it, and you kind of never finish the text before the light goes out. Okay, then this is where some rather gruesome ones are going to come, so you can kind of close your eyes. The medical head and its desecration. Which is linked really to what I was talking about. Here you have Joel Peter Witkin, Man Without a Head, next to Andres Serrano, The Morgue, Death Unknown, 1991. Both of them used corpses from morgues, I believe in the case of Witkin in Mexico, as subjects for photographs. Witkin, The Kiss. So you get this sort of attempt to deal with this uncanniness through a sort of desecration, I would say, in this case. And our very own Damien Hirst with dead head in 1991. Again, a head in not in a morgue, I think, but in an anatomy theatre. And Mark Quinn's Self of 1991 made with 10 pints of his own blood. So if blood is associated with kind of life, this in a sense becomes a sort of bio-portrait of himself. by way of a transition to the notion of this term that Giorgio Agamben came up with through his reading of Hannah Arendt, this idea of bare life. But rather than do it philosophically, I want to approach it through some paintings, specifically in this case, paintings by Géricault of guillotine heads of 1880 to 20. He made a number of drawings and paintings of guillotine heads, which were ostensibly studies for his Raft of the Medusa that he was working on around the same time. So you see some studies there, drawings, and the Raft of the Medusa. Actually, I'll just go back to these for a minute. So there he's playing, he's put a man and a woman, as it were, in bed together, and then you realize they're both decapitated heads with a kind of horror. Interestingly, the painting, given where we began, is called The Raft of the Medusa. And it depicts a moment when, after the French naval frigate Medusa ran aground in 1816, 147 were people set off on a raft that they'd hastily constructed. And all but 15 died before they were rescued, and there were rumors of cannibalism and so on that had taken place. And it became an international scandal, and it was interpreted also as a political allegory against the restored French monarchy. But again, you have this link of a sort of horror with the name Medusa. Géricault also painted a series of portraits of the insane or monomaniacs, commissioned by a friend of his who was chief of the Salpêtrière mental hospital in Paris. He painted them between 1820 and 24. These were patients in La Salpêtrière. Géricault had, there was a lot of mental illness in Géricault's own family, and he had a collapse himself and may have been treated by this particular doctor, so perhaps owed him a favor. And he painted these portraits for La Salpêtrière. And what interests me, I'm obviously not kind of decapitated, but what interests me is the relationship with the decapitated images as life becoming a kind of enigma. The interior life of these people is, in a sense, closed to us. And so I think there is a sort of homology, if you like, between the idea of life embodied in the images of the head, specifically of the head, and the condition that he's trying to depict. So a sort of opacity, an opacity of what life is. Oops. I should finish fairly soon. We're nearly at the end. This is not. Okay. Festival. Well, I should say something. Well, I'll say that later on. Festival of the Headless. Going back to Hobbes, to this image of sovereignty in Hobbes, and comparing it with Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci, famous ideal image of the male human body. You can see both of them being picked up on by the cover of this publication, Acéphale, which means headless, without head, which was organized by the dissident surrealist Georges Bataille, and the cover was designed by André Masson in 1936. Now, Asifal named a society that Bataille founded, a secret society it was supposed to be, which had its rituals, and its rituals included refusing to shake hands with anti-Semites and celebrations of the decapitation of Louis XVI. So it's connected with the French Revolution and the redistribution of sovereignty. It's also connected with the rise of fascism in the 1930s. So there's a kind of response to the rise of fascism. And the writings and discussions were around the texts of Nietzsche, Freud, Sartre, and the anthropologist Marcel Mauss. Texts were read and discussed during the assemblies of this group of artists, anthropologists, and so on, who were members. It's obviously very problematic as a response to fascism. It's a sort of found a secret society that is highly based on the irrational. And it perhaps epitomizes also the problem of surrealism in relation to how to deal with the rise of fascism and of Nazism. But it also is sort of meditation on the redistribution of sovereignty away from the head to the body, and the secret society as an attempt to found a community. So, relation with foundation or institution, a sort of repudiation of hierarchy, but also linked with surrealism and psychoanalysis, a critique of rationality. And in his journal Document, Bataille published this picture by a couple of pictures, of which this is one by Boiffard, photographer, of the big toe of a 30-year-old man. And he published also the essay, The Big Toe. And I'm putting this in because the big toe is at the opposite end of the body to the head. It's about as far away from the head as you can get. But it's not, as Bataille argues, it's not simply animal. Other animals don't have big toes, he says, because the big toe has to do with, develop when you're out of the trees and standing. So the big toe is to do with an upright stance. It's the most base and necessary element of the human characteristic of standing upright. So locating humanity in the body and in stance, and at the same time away from the head into something that is kind of has this dimension of the abject. Okay, from the post-human prosthetic head to the high-def digital head. So to finish, before concluding, I want to just compare two more contemporary artists. One of them is Bruce Nauman, and I want to think about his installation called Feed Me Anthro Socio Rinder Spinning of 1992, of which these are different elements. I just realized I don't think I have the actual one I should have had, but I'll show you that afterwards. It's down there somewhere, because that's an installation involving also video. And I'll describe it on 3 projection surfaces and 6 monitors. One sees the head of a man shown in different takes, continually revolving around its own axis, upright and upside down, and sings feed me, eat me, anthropology, help me, hurt me, sociology. And feed me, help me, eat me, hurt me. So you have a tension between the human body and the discourse of knowledge. And in the other works that you're looking at here, you have, which include 4 pairs of heads, head, candle, hold, stack, and so on. You have these casts of heads. The heads become something like prostheses. So this idea of a sort of prosthetic notion of the human, sort of linked with discourse with ideas of the post-human. So, so the problem of the experience of the body and the prosthetic object. And I find it interesting to compare that with Ed Atkins' work. In particular, Us Dead Love Talk of 2012, HD video with panels that was at the Chisenhale Gallery, which is essentially a conversation between 2 corpses about an eyelash caught in a foreskin. The text of the script is published and you can get it online, and there are 2 production stills there. Ed has said that he is interested in the relation between the extreme realism of high-def video and its extreme coldness. And often the text is used to bring in the script, to bring in the body as sexual and as diseased and as dying, all the things that somehow the coldness of the video doesn't seem to convey. But also interested in the peculiar status of the corpse as a model for the image. That the corpse is both extremely present to a horrifying degree, but also embodies a kind of extreme absence, namely of the person that, as living, inhabited it. So the question is then, what would be the attempt in the image to create this sort of paradoxical combination? And indeed, the literary critic and philosopher Maurice Blanchot in France wrote a wonderful text called The 2 Versions of the Imaginary, in which he describes the image as he tries to characterize the peculiar being of the image as presence and absence, and he compares it with a cause. Now, this idea of coldness also comes up with Thomas Hirschhorn. Here I show you an installation, an incommensurable banner of 2007, in which there were many images of atrocity. In a sense, collage, torn from magazines, newspapers, printed out from the internet, and collaged onto the wall and onto tables. He also made a work called Touching Reality, which consisted of a video from an iPad where images of atrocity would appear and a hand would, sweep them, make this movement to move on the image. And he says, as you would do, say, with images of a holiday, you would do the same thing. And so the relation of the hand to the image has this double dimension. On the one hand, it's attempting to touch or to get close to, but he also describes it as a very cold gesture, sweeping, in a sense, sweeping away, so that it disappears. So, you know, it's quite a disturbing work. It's projected quite big, and contains this double dimension. Now, to come to some kind of conclusion, perhaps one of the horrifying dimensions of images of decapitation in the news is their closeness to the kind of thing that might go on in a video. And yet, our knowledge that, you know, this is an actual living person who has been killed. So I think, you know, that kind of tension is also reflected on the Hirschfeld work, and perhaps to some degree in Ed Atkins, living in that kind of image world where these two dimensions come together. Now, the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, was compared with video games because much of the imagery that was distributed in the West was based on placing cameras in missile heads, which create a point of view that is at once a first-person point of view and yet inhuman. It's not a positional process bodily vision can occupy. This was already something explored in art, in the films of Michael Snow, for example, Wavelength with its 40-minute zoom. Our eyes don't zoom, so, you know, in a sense, the artist is putting us in a position of having a kind of camera vision. Deleuze talks about this in his book, Cinema One. And even more in his film La Région Centrale, where in a sort of wilderness in Canada, in Quebec, he placed a mechanism which allowed the camera to make a 360-degree pan and made a film, I think it's about 5 hours in length, in segments of this occurring. So again, a non-human vision, which was partly inspired by the landings on the moon. The inhuman perspective has also been extended to drones in Omar Fust's 5,000 Feet is the Best in 2011. It shows the traumatic effect of the conjunction of this non-human perspective with responsibility for actual deaths on a drone pilot. So again, dealing with this, you know, this kind of contradictory or paradoxical situation. You could say that perhaps say that the IS beheadings bring the video game effect of the medium of video on social media very starkly in relation, as I've said, to the murder of an actual person and the enigma of the moment of death that we rarely, if ever, confront in our daily lives. Something similar to this is seen in the sorts of contradictory experiences that Ed explores in his videos that I've talked about. Another dimension of this phenomenon we could approach by evoking the description in Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish of the execution of Damiens before the French Revolution. After the monarchy, he had attempted an assassination of the king, and his body was broken on a wheel and pulled apart. This takes place within the social space of an absolutist monarchy, which will be replaced, as Foucault argues, by the internalized discipline of the surveillance mechanism of the panopticon, which for us through the digital has precisely become absolutized, so total surveillance through the digital, total panopticon kind of existence. So we could see the sort of eruption of beheadings on the screen as a kind of pre-modern spectacle within a modernity of totalized surveillance and deliberately using this contrast in a sense. which is another big, precisely because it's this contrast, is another reason why I think it's a phenomenon of modernity. And in a sense, it marks the symptom of a failure already marked in the recourse of the French Revolution to the guillotine as an instrument of decapitation, which the Marquis de Sade saw at work outside his prison window, when the Enlightenment project turns into a paranoid attempt at absolute purification. Some 16,594 people were killed by guillotine between 5th September 1793 and 28th July 1794. But a failure of what? Of the Enlightenment project, of capital, of the relation between the two. So what I hope to have conveyed is the way in which the beheadings, which are on the screen, in social media and so on, are as images heavily overdetermined by religion, by the history of colonialism, by global capitalism and its imperial ventures, and by the imagery of the sovereign and the foundation of the state. And it's not unconnected, I think, with the crisis, you could say, of sovereignty now. You know, the disintegration of the role of nation states, for example, and the relation of governments to nation states in the global context. So the decapitation is a founding moment of the modern notion of distributed sovereignty, the idea of the French Revolution was that this would be universal, but came to be associated with republics, with nation states. And it's precisely at the moment that this order is disintegrating, and that this disintegration, which obviously has been going on for some time, raises at the same time questions around life, identity, and so on. That this imagery is experiencing a kind of resurgence. There's a resurgence, not only in the news, but as I hope I've conveyed, also in art. There are many different kinds of beheadings. Okay. Discussion.
So you're saying that that because we are kind of so removed from experiencing death or experiencing in the Western world, where kind of after the French Revolution, war is more weird. I mean, it doesn't happen in our. I mean, in this corner and in Europe, old Europe area or something, we don't experience death firsthand like in other parts of the world?
No, that's not really what I'm trying to say. I mean, first of all, obviously there are many parts of the world where death is directly experienced. What I'm discussing is a phenomenon that is a mediated phenomenon. So I'm not denying the experience of death. But what you say kind of makes something spring to my mind, which is a sort of previous moment of the rethinking of sovereignty was connected with the Second World War. Before the Second World War by Bataille, but after the Second World War by Hannah Arendt, and this was then taken up by Giorgio Agamben in his notion of their life and the relationship of law to life in the foundation of the state, and the creation of a sort of outside on the inside as a sphere of exception where law does not apply, which is identified then with the camps, the concentration camps specifically. So the image there of if you like, the question of sovereignty and its failure, or its violence, is there manifested through the image of the camp. Now, the situation now, it could be argued, is, or it has been argued, is that the state of exception, which comes from a Nazi jurist called Schmidt, who claimed that the one who, as it were, institutes the law is accepted from the law. And in crisis, a state may institute a state of exception when the law doesn't apply. And the argument is now, we're all now living in a state of exception, so that the condition in relation to law of the camps has been generalized. So maybe in a sense, precisely because of that, we need another image through which to think about sovereignty. I don't think the image of decapitation is that. I'm not advocating that as a sort of positive image, but it raises questions which I'm not sure are the same questions as are raised by the camp as an image of the crisis, or the very founding crisis of sovereignty. But that's probably a roundabout answer. Now, I'm not arguing for, that we should, I'm not really necessarily arguing simply for empathy, that we should have that. It's more to do with the kind of structure that I'm trying to think about.
Hi. In previous discussions with you talked about the guillotine as an image maker. I wonder if you could discuss that further, but maybe in relation to the decapitations by IS as well. What that would mean.
That's a good point. The guillotine, even in its sort of use in the 18th century, was described as a machine for producing portraits. If you think about, a portrait is usually cut off at the neck or the shoulders. So to make a portrait is to, in a sense, mostly to cut off the head of the body. So this analogy occurred to them that that's exactly what the guillotine does. And then this is a real portrait. Not only that, but it's the truest portrait there could be, because the subject is no longer able to dissemble or put on an act. So it's a kind of moment of truth. So holding up the head is it's a moment of truth. Now, Daniel Arras, in a book on the guillotine, kind of extends this, and he thinks about the analogy between a guillotine and the shutter of a camera. And he goes on to compare the sort of decapitation with photography, to suggest that, it's not only a portrait machine, but as you said, kind of machine for producing images. How that might link back with the IS decapitations, I'm not sure, except they certainly are attempts to generate images of the act to achieve certain ends. one of those ends being to try to lure America and the Western powers, United States and the Western powers, into war. And it's clearly one thing that they're trying to do, to put troops on the ground that they can then fight. Also to terrify their enemies, but also as a recruiting tool. And the recruiting thing then may link up with the idea of a sort of jouissance of martyrdom that I was talking about in relation to John the Baptist. So it's not the head of the enemy anymore, it's the head of the one who joins and becomes a martyr. So yes, it is the decapitation is meant to be you're right, it is an image-producing device, machine. You'll have succeeded if it proliferates itself. If it endlessly proliferates images, which will then go on to have effects. And there's almost no way of stopping this, obviously, given the nature of the internet. Do you have any further thought?
No, really. I think I'm quite interested in the difference between the head as the object and the head as the person. And where that differentiation lies. And so, as the image maker, the portrait maker, it makes the other almost an immediate freezing point. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's with all this stuff with the IS. I mean, everything you see mediated on TV about the person whose head has been severed from their body is very much about their personal identity.
About
their personal identity,
right.
Who they are. And at that moment, they're still frozen. They're frozen as that person because of this kind of decapitation process as well. Somewhere in that, I've got a question. I'm not sure where it is.
And in a way, yeah. No, that's a very good point. I think you need to, as you suggest, distinguish between the head, the portrait, and the face. Okay. The portrait is a representation of a person through which they might express themselves or not. The face is not necessarily the same as the portrait. The portrait may be an attempt to, as it were, catch the face or limit the face in a representation. But as the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas says, bases the ethical relation on the face. He says the face overflows its form, because the face is the manifestation of the singular and absolute otherness of the person. But the portrait might manifest their characteristics, but not necessarily their otherness to which you are responsible, in some sense, or for which you are responsible. The head is then something else, because it's the object, the thing in relation to those. It's a sort of strange knob on the top of the body, a kind of excrescence that can be cut off. And so cutting off the head in relation to the identity of the person is almost like an attempt perhaps to control or to show that you dominate it. I mean, you have the David and the head of Goliath image, perhaps in that respect, a very interesting character. He makes himself one of those heads, but maybe in a sense feeling emotionally dominated by the young man who's posing. I don't know, but yeah. So there's some attempt perhaps to expression of power. Which may also be linked with the use not of a guillotine, but of a small knife. Look how, I have no weapon practically, but this kind of
just wanted to ask you to talk a bit more about this concept of jouissance, this something which is self-identical, absolute, but I don't know how to something more about that.
Yeah, it's a concept that the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan adapted from, I think partly from legal theory, in fact, where you have the enjoyment of something, to make a distinction in the life of the subject between, if you like, their relationship to substitutes for the lost object, and their impossible relationship to what one might think of as the lost object itself. And the relationship to objects of desire arise through separation, through giving something up as a result of a prohibition, namely the prohibition of incest. So in the sense that you desire, whatever you desire is a substitute, if you like, for what you really, really want, which is the object that wasn't even an object, that was a sort of fusionary relationship in a sense, that was a sort of absolute. But you can't have the absolute, because if you had the absolute, it would destroy you. You would no longer exist as a desiring subject. You would be torn apart. You would cease to be in that sense. So it's also the provoker of a kind of anxiety, this thing that Lacan describes as this object beyond desire. And then, you can perhaps find in certain sort of tropes a relationship, what might be a relationship with this, or an attempt at a relationship with this beyond, which could involve a renunciation of desire or renunciation of sexuality or something like that. Not in the name of abstinence so much as in the name of a greater, more absolute enjoyment, which could be associated with a mystic, some kind of a mystic experience. Which is also very dangerous because, not only because it involves the destruction of the subject, or perhaps you can only achieve it in fantasy through your destruction in some sense, but also because it has a certain kind of immobility. There is no other in relation to it. So any other is going to threaten, in some sense, or risks threatening this absolute relationship. So it has to be destroyed in order to maintain, the relationship to that which is not in relation to anything else. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think that. Also, you mentioned Levinas as well, yes. And I read some Levinas, and he talks about this kind of ethics and how, in a sense, there is no. You talked about the face, this kind of the face of the other. And if I remember Levinas, he was proposing a very extreme form of ethics in which there is no return from the other. There's no return from the other. There is no reflexivity.
Oh yes, no, it's not reciprocal.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So the role of the face in that relationship is quite complex, I think. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. No, it is. I mean, it's very problematic because it's not about identity. It's not an ethic that has anything to do with identity. It's to do with singularity, with the irreplaceability of the other, their incomparability to anyone else. Whereas identity has some dimension that has to do with I'm like them, something like that. We're like each other. We form this group of shared experience or something like like that. So it's not an ethic based on identity. So that how does it deal with those political issues that have to do with identity? It's very problematic. So I'm not advocating necessarily a Levinasian ethic. But maybe to get back to this issue of jouissance, it clearly is a dimension of the narrative of martyrdom. I mean, universally, I don't mean necessarily, martyrdom in the Islamic context, just as much in the Christian context. That, on the one hand, okay, it's a sacrifice for an ideal or religion, but it's a sort of very problematic, perhaps, ecstatic dimension to it, and that, in that sense of a relationship with a thing that is absolute, that brooks no relation to anything else, that is a sort of total commitment, and that is threatened by any sort of comparability.
So there's some sort of similarity between Levinas in this sense of this other, which is the other becomes the absolute in Levinas, doesn't it, in some way? Is that right? The other with no other identity apart from its own self-identity.
Yeah, I mean, the question would be if it still links with an idea of jouissance, which I think Levinas would probably deny, but then on what basis does he make the distinction? He talks about trauma, he talks about the relationship to the other. He uses the language of trauma in his second major book, Otherwise Than Being, or Beyond Essence. So it's beyond being, it's beyond essence. That's what I mean, it's also beyond the world of exchange in a sense. And because it's therefore unmediated, the ethical experience is traumatic. So he uses this language of trauma, but how can he then distinguish between a trauma that is ethical, a trauma that is nothing to do with the ethical, that is just a trauma, and a trauma that is to do with some kind of extreme of jouissance? It's very problematic, and my argument with Levinas is that he can't do it without bringing God in. God is the basis of the distinction, and that's why he needs to bring God in, and that's why it's, for me, a problematic basis for ethics.
To beat a dead horse about jouissance, so in discussing jouissance in the decapitated head, how the decapitated head is itself, or the act of decapitation, is sort of machine which jouissance is somehow generated.
Yes.
Thinking about jouissance, I guess in earliest feminist writing, how the early feminists interpreted Freud's analysis of women suffering from hysteria as a type of jouissance. And I'm thinking about different ways in which this is kind of treated, and what I'm thinking of is, does this have any sort of relation with the act of lobotomizing and this sort of machine which to undo it? How does that deal with
Lobotomizing?
Yeah.
You mean there are people who lobotomize for pleasure?
This kind of...
as an image, as a fantasy?
Yes.
I don't know, you probably have an answer to this. I've never thought, I mean, I can see as an image the link between decapitation and jouissance is, I mean, you can see it in Bataille, in the Asifar, in the sort of, if you like, the joy of the blood spurting from the neck and spreading, distributing itself, or something like that. And you can see that decapitation and maybe martyrdom more generally can be understood also in terms of extreme pleasure, but lobotomizing as a sort of neutralization or something, I find it hard, but maybe that it's something I don't know about this. I don't know. Maybe is there some dimension in which we want to be lobotomized somehow?
The kind of hysteria is a type of jouissance that exists, and jouissance something that one cannot experience without being themselves destroyed, is sort of a, I guess, reassertion of subject, maybe.
I don't know, I think maybe that may be a sort of confusion of the, if you like, I can see why you want to sort of make that relationship between, on the one hand, the death drive, which is also a kind of, excessive life, in fact, with a living death, which would be a kind of being lobotomized. That would being lobotomized be achieving that sort of reduction of tension that Freud associates with the death drive. Maybe that would be a critique of the notion of the death drive. It is actually, lobotomization would be the perfect manifestation of the death drive. I'm not sure. You could perhaps go in that direction. Yeah, I mean, but this idea that if desire is to do with a sort of discharge, or sort of raising tension and then lowering it, is kind of the difference. That the death drive is to do with, a sort of somehow a pulse which is even, which does not have to do with tension and release. And maybe the idea of being lobotomized could, in some sense, link to that. So, yeah, maybe.
I have a slight disagreement with you about the Hobbes frontispiece, and it sort of maybe connects to this idea of the guillotine as an image maker, and then the artist perhaps as the executioner, and even the executioned in some sense. I'm pretty sure that the image on the frontispiece is actually Hobbes himself, and not the king. And this I know only because I know Hobbes' mustache and beard so well. And then if you see, he has a sword in one hand and a quill in the other. So in some sense, it's not about that top-down, it's not about the bottom-up, as you said, but the top-down, actually, that Hobbes, as the author, is actually the authority. And we, as readers, are a kind of subject, and I wondered how, if you buy that,
that's a wonderful interpretation. It would be very cheeky of Hobbes, I mean, like, to put himself.
Yeah, if you map this to cases, I'm pretty sure.
In the divine position. It would have an interesting connection with Velázquez's Las Meninas in that respect. In that, as you know, the viewer and artist of the making are in the position, effectively, of the monarch. I mean, or at least the viewer is put in the position of the monarch, the sovereign subject that Foucault describes. Yeah, no, that's a very interesting interpretation. But I think it is, I mean, maybe that moustache was very, maybe he liked to have a moustache like King, and everybody, had these moustaches. I think it is also an image of kingship. So it could be both. I'm not sure they mean necessarily be one or the other. And it's an image in which the idea is that the body and the head need each other, that they're one. Without the body, the head wouldn't survive. So that the monarch needs the body, as the body supposedly needs the head, without which it would be blind, in a sense, and not knowing which direction to take. But it's a nice idea, I think, about that.
This isn't really a question, it's more like, does anyone else have a thought about this? Sure. With political leaders having Facebook pages and social media identities, and how we create images of ourselves, often faceless. I mean, to be faceless on Facebook has become kind of a thing. And I just am thinking about how it seems that the system of validation is either between classicism or religion. So I was thinking about Napoleon and how, you have this happening in 1651, I think, and then by the time Napoleon comes back and names himself emperor, he's already, accepting a position that's closer to classicism to make him a lawful ruler, but at the same time approaching divinity. And then you have the American government, which still doesn't have a separation between religion and state, and sort of the divine role of that president. And then when we put that in the context of social media, how is it that decapitation plays into this identity of how we identify our rulers?
Okay, that's a very interesting. Sorry, did you finish?
Yeah.
That's a very interesting question, and it sort of. I think what might be relevant in an answer is something I didn't discuss. I mean, time is short, and the whole sort of analytical and philosophical discussion around what's called the theological political is very extensive. Now, there's another French philosopher called Claude Lefort, so L-E-F-O-R-T, who writes on the relationship of totalitarianism and democracy. In a sense, also, perhaps like Agamben, but in a different way, in the wake of Hannah Arendt, but within the French context of the relation to the French Revolution. And his argument is that what the execution of the king, decapitation of the king signifies for democracy, which was, after all, the aim of the revolutionaries at some level, is that the place of power must henceforth remain empty. So he says democracy needs the place of power to be empty. The place of power being the place of, if you like, the institution of the law, not the place of day-to-day execution of government acts or whatever. And then he argues from that fascism is always the attempt to fill the place of power with a body. So the body takes the place of this empty place and becomes the source of power, legitimacy, and the state. So you would have the body of Mussolini, the body of Hitler, the body of Stalin. Some argument has been made against this, that he doesn't distinguish, for example, fascism and totalitarianism. They have different structures, but that's the basic argument. That's taken in a sort of interesting direction by, I think, by Slavoj Žižek following Hegel, where he argues that, say, in a constitutional monarchy, the place of power is occupied by a sort of stupid body subject to an idiotic hereditary principle. So it's like the place of power is occupied by somebody who actually doesn't have any power, and is, it's a way of keeping other people from occupying. So, we can't have a fascist president because the Queen's already there, this kind of thing. So that's how constitution, it's a variation on that. That perhaps gives another line on the relationship of the body and the image to the place of power post-revolution, because, distinguished from pre-revolution. So what Napoleon is doing when he has this ludicrous portrait of himself is, in a sense, being painted as the one who occupies the empty place of power. So it's not like he's a pre-revolutionary absolute monarch. He's more like a fascist in that respect. In the way that he's depicted, and that's perhaps an explanation of why it has to be excessive, because it's an excessiveness that conceals a kind of void, which is the necessary emptiness that is the, if you like, the core of modern democracy.
Because when people die, their Facebook pages continue. And you were talking about the bodies that were created to fill the space between the body of the former king and the new king. And I'm thinking about how, well, I'm also thinking about newness. You know, someone was saying to me the other day, how do we do something that is truly new? And to create iconography that is outside of classical validation or religious validation, outside of the realm of creating a hyper body that exists during you and after you. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense. I'm just interested to know if you think that there is a way to get outside of this system, to no longer validate through the face. Can we move beyond the face, or is that our permanent identity?
Well, maybe what that question raises is the relationship of, if you like, life beyond the living to technology. Like living on is always a sort of question of technology in a way, isn't it? I mean, somebody is going to remember you in writing, or photographs will survive, or an effigy of the body is made to continue your life in the community, which was how the Roman paterfamilias had himself portrayed, you know, as a wax effigy who would then be wheeled out at weddings and so on, and so he'd actually be able to be there. So how does that, I guess what your question perhaps is partly answering, how does that function in the age of the internet and social media? And how do we think about the relationship between technology and life? Is the technology in some sense an extension of our lives? Do we still live in the internet page that continues after our mortal body has died? Is that the...
Yeah, it's the conclusion, but I'm interested to know if that's definitely where I'm going in my mind, but as you have way more information than I do, I'm wondering if you see any light at the end of this faceful tunnel. You know, I saw a really interesting exhibition in Vienna called Faceless, where it was not only works where people had eliminated their face, but it was video pieces about, you know, the faceless people of Google who scan the images of all the literature that we read online and all this kind of stuff, and attempting to look at this other side where now we try to hide our identity, where we try to not be identified solely by our face, but by some other action that we do. And I'm wondering if you think that that's possible, that we could invent a society that no longer identified by the face.
I think the capacity and the right to disappear is very difficult in the age of a kind of total internet tracking and surveillance. So, you know, maybe, you know, for much of history, freedom and, in a sense, agency and therefore sovereignty is to do with appearing. You know, the king appeared in public, in ceremonies, or not even in public. In fact, you know, the monarch had to appear in their bedroom, you know, in a levee or whatever it was called. They had no privacy, effectively. Henry VIII had a bum washer, which was considered to be a great privilege to be his sort of bum cleaner after he went to the toilet. So the whole conception of privacy was completely different. So that's one notion of appearance. Then there's a notion of, you know, appearing in the public sphere to speak and to act as the modern sense of political agency. Maybe now the problem isn't so much appearing as disappearing. I mean, I'm not quite sure how to develop that or what that would mean politically. But disappearing seems to be the thing that it's impossible. The freedom that we don't have is the freedom to disappear. Or it's a very, very difficult.
Mike, I'm really sorry. I think we might have to exercise our freedom to disappear. Some people, I know they've had to do their fallout from the nuclear war shortly. So, but please, I'm sure we can continue these conversations. Please join me in thanking